According to surveys, many Germans regard Iran as a major threat to Germany and Europe. I would now like to talk about this with a man who embodies the past, but possibly also the future of Iran like no other. I would like to welcome Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah of Persia. He has been living in exile since the overthrow of the Shah in the 1979 revolution. He's currently living in the USA. Reza Pahlavi is politically committed to the protection of human rights and peaceful change in Iran. Sir, although you have been living in exile for more than 35 years now, many people in Iran still see you as the heir to the throne, the crown prince. What motivates you to remain politically active?
My motivation is when I see millions of Iranians, particularly today's generation, that since the inception of the regime in Iran were the first victim of terrorism and were taken as the first hostage of a regime. And today all they're asking for, and have always asked for, is their liberties, their freedoms, their opportunities, which has been taken away generation after generation. Our fight is for a better life, a better future, a future of opportunities, a future where, as a country with such civilization, certainly deserve better than this radical regime that has repressed them, that has been the first element of discriminating against women, ethnic groups, religious minorities. That's not the Iran we know. Our Iran is the Iran that believes in principles of human rights, believes in liberty, believes in equality, believes in peaceful relationship with our neighbors. We're not hostile to a faith or a religion or another creed, unlike this regime is. That's the motivation. The motivation is to tell the world our Iran is not the Iran you see today. Iranians are the first victims of this regime, but they will be the liberator of our country, and I'm here to be their voice.
So we are meeting here in Munich while the Munich Security Conference takes place. Initially, as a leading representative of the Iranian opposition, you were formally invited or informally invited to the Security Conference, but then you were not allowed to attend. How do you explain that?
I see how Tehran is pulling the strings of the government in Berlin. This is clearly an indication of the consequences of appeasement and thinking that by caving in the regime you can lead to a outcome in terms of whatever is your expectation or behavior. The problem is that from the very beginning, this regime has been taking hostages. It started with the American personnel in the US Embassy, and fast forward to present day. Every time there's been weakness vis-a-vis this regime, it has emboldened them to even take some more. In fact, when since these days everybody talks about the nuclear issue, during the Obama administration, there were at the time about 4 American hostages in Iran that they were trying to negotiate. And as a result of that administration, the number elevated itself to about 20 hostages, combination of American and European hostages. I use the term hostages on purpose because there comes a point that if it's a matter of sensitivity, economic interest, how far can you push the envelope that national interest is at stake? This has taken a point that, as I was talking to a French senator last week when I was in Paris, he was saying that we are becoming hostages to our hostages. We're just caving in to that kind of blackmail. And if our world is supposed to be governed by the most dictatorial regimes to dictate to the free world that this is the way to go, I think that there is a time where whether you are an Iranian or a German or a Briton or an American, and you say, is it really us caving in to these kind of regimes? When is it going to stop?
So are you saying that the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock caved into Iran? And if so, what is her motive?
Thinking that by doing so, they can appease the regime from not taking any more measures to threaten perhaps more hostages. But as I was just telling you, that's a failed policy. Appeasement doesn't work. In fact, it only leads to taking more hostages. It's a cycle that has no end. The problem is that when you demonstrate this kind of weakness, you only encourage the regime to do even more of that. When you try to appease them and give them more money like Biden did, They end up reinforcing their proxies in the Middle East that could lead to something like October 7th. It's a direct result of this kind of appeasement that leads only this regime to be more emboldened. But at the cost of whom? At the cost of millions of people who continue to be shot in the streets and murdered and executed in jails. This is the consequence. And I think that our appeal as Iranians to the free world is, whose side are you on? Are you going to help us put an end to our misery by helping us overcome this situation? Or are you going to continue to cut deals with this regime? And they have done that systematically. This is not the first time this happens. In 1985, I was supposed to come here to give a speech in a stadium where the Iranians were gathering. They stopped my entry to this country at the time, and I was declared persona non grata. It's nothing new, unfortunately. It's a continuation of that tactic of appeasement in the name of securing some economic interests or what have you.
So as we are talking about the German government, we have elections coming up in Germany. What do you expect from a future government in Germany?
Again, it's understanding that, look, it's not by coincidence that liberty came to countries that needed to be freed from regimes that they didn't want. Towards the end of the Cold War, look at what happened with Lech Walesa and Solidarity. It could not have happened without some support from the free world. Same thing for Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa that ultimately put an end to apartheid. What I'm trying to say here is that when we're talking about how people, especially when they're dealing with extremely repressive regimes, need some added element of support, and that has been part of my campaign strategy of explaining to the outside world, look, you're putting maximum pressure by means of sanctions and what have you on the regime, but what's lacking is a campaign of maximum support for the people. These two ingredients combined can bring the difference. And the solution to all problems, whether you look at it from the perspective of Iranians at home or foreign governments from the outside looking in, whether it's nuclear threat, terrorism, radicalism, financing all these groups that are creating instability, the Houthis in Yemen, everything is tied to the same root problem, which is the regime in Tehran.
Yeah.
And as long as the regime is there, we won't be able to see a solution.
The Islamic regime in Tehran is currently considered to be severely weakened domestically, but also when it comes to foreign policy. Does Iran nevertheless pose a threat to the West?
Well, the regime poses a threat to the West, which is why we keep saying, instead of looking at the solution.
But how exactly does it pose a threat to the West? What do you think?
Because in its DNA, it's in ideology, its conflict of survival depends on having the Western world fail for all the values it stands for. We are talking, as you know, on the same principles of liberty, of peace, of freedom, of enjoying life. All they know is celebrating martyrdom. All they know is how to murder people, kill people, eliminate people, eradicate people in order to survive as an ideology. It's not even a national sentiment. Iran doesn't even matter to them. The Revolutionary Guards don't have the name Iran incorporated in their title. Yeah. In what way do you think the Iranian people could connect with this regime? The world needs to understand that in dealing with Iran, you have to deal with the Iranian people who happen to be on your side. Yet for 46 years and counting, you have only focused your attention on the regime and its representative. You have really never looked at Iranians as a solution to the problem. That's my entire argument. The Western governments, in Europe in particular, are way behind the curve when it comes to adjusting to what's the reality today in Iran, and understand that ultimately the solution is not cutting deals with this regime or appeasing them or anything like that. Rather than liberating these people, who will be the first agent that will eliminate any kind of threat that this regime poses to you, and on top of it, provides opportunities for a healthier growth in the worldwide economy, including ours. It's a win-win situation. Until now, it's been lose-lose. Mm-hmm. A loss for the Iranian people, a loss to the free world, only the regime benefits. We have to change that dimension completely.
How likely do you think it is that you will be able to return to Iran one day?
Well, the minute the country opens up for an opportunity for me to be there, I'll be there to help. You know, it pains me that I wish I could be there right now and do everything that I'm talking about.
But how are the chances? How is the dynamic in Iran right now when it comes to opposition?
The dynamics, I think the Iranian people are more than ever ready. I'm sure if you had followed at least the last few days, which was right around the anniversary of the Iranian so-called revolution, people have been on the streets all the time, demonstrating, chanting, death to the dictator, death to this regime. They organize themselves, they demonstrate every strata of society. The economic situation in Iran is really terrible. Inflation, the loss of our currency, wages not being paid, is simply not sustainable. And on the political side, it's been a long time since they have demonstrated their aspirations. Today, they need the real support to make that final change. I believe the ingredients are in place. It's the first time in 46 years that the people are the strongest and the regime is at its weakest. It's an opportunity for the whole world to benefit from. And by liberating Iran, you're not just liberating a nation, you're liberating a whole region, perhaps even change the course of history for the world. And that's what's missing here, because if everybody is hoping to avoid conflict, if everybody doesn't want to see the direction where there might be inevitable escalation of conflict, the quickest way not to go in that route is to use this opportunity to bring the final formula of change, which is this regime disappears under a combination of external pressure and supporting the people of Iran. That's the way we ought to think, as opposed to yet again sit at a table hoping that this time, unlike previous times, we are going to do the same and somehow the result will be different. Albert Einstein said that's insanity.
Somebody who does not want to do the same thing and is more about disruption is the new US President, Donald Trump. He's taking a very tough line on Iran. Is he going to the right direction?
Well, look, under his first mandate, when it started implementing maximum pressure, it did work. The regime in Tehran backed off. When you look at the statistics between the Obama administration and the Biden administration, just for that pressure alone, the number of executions in Iran were more than half of what it was between those two administrations, who were much more lenient, much more appeasing towards the regime, just on a one line item only. But as I said, pressure from outside by itself is not sufficient. If the mindset is we're doing all that to give the regime an attitude change, again, that's also false. I don't think that President Trump and his new administration, because I know some of them, I talk to them, people like Marco Rubio, people like Jim Walz, they understand much better what are the circumstances. And I think at the end they will understand that if we want to avoid escalation, if we have to get to a situation that doesn't engage America yet again in some other conflict of campaign, the best way to address that is to change the situation from within. And the element that creates that are the people. So therefore, come and help the people overcome. You don't need to send your troops. You don't need to spend your taxpayers' money on that. It exists. The boots on the ground are the people of Iran themselves. And there are ways to perhaps redirect frozen assets to support, for instance, labor strikes in Iran, which is one way to go to put pressure from within, instead of spending out of your own governmental budget, which we're not asking for. Yeah. There are solutions to the problem if only you decide to implement that policy. And that's exactly part of the reason why I'm traveling the four corners of the world, trying to explain to legislators and policymakers that you should reset your policies this time towards that direction.
This week we did an interview with Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, and he said that European states should stop the Iranian nuclear program by reinstating the sanctions. Do you think that would be the right way to go?
But certainly if we are referring to, let's say, snapback and anything else that is incorporated in that, certainly that's one way of curtailing the regime's ability. But you need to go beyond the mindset of status quo. In other words, all the calculation has always been, we weaken the regime, we contain the regime, we isolate the regime, but as long as the regime is still there, you may, push back a little bit that nuclear threshold, but what about the other aspects of this regime? It's not going to stop their funding of Islamic centers that are funding organizations that promote anti-Semitism or this or that. It's not going to change that. And there's no clause in any of the negotiations that has been used all this time about the nuclear issue that incorporates any of that. What about the rest of that?
Some people would argue that the sanctions we are currently talking about only hurt the Iranian people. Would you advocate for other forms of sanction, for example, against the Revolutionary Guard?
Well, first of all, let's ask the people who say that, where has the money trickled to the Iranian people? This extra almost $200 billion that the Biden administration allowed the regime to have access to, what was it spent on? Did it trickle to the Iranian people? Do you think that if the sanctions are removed, this regime is going to care about paying the salaries of workers or retirees? It hasn't. If it wanted to do that, they had the opportunity 30 years ago when the best possible deal was offered President Khatami, and they didn't take it. Not because they were stupid, but because they knew that they are basically changing the nature of every agenda that the regime has had. And it has been systematically the same approach. Now, going back to your question, absolutely. I've been an advocate of supporting the necessity of escalating the pressure on the regime by putting the IRGC on the list of terrorist organizations. The problem that we have is not so much at the level of legislation in Europe, is that governments yet again refuse to do that. Again, on the same logic that we don't want to ruffle the regime's feathers, just in case we have to have, some element for negotiation to try to resolve the nuclear crisis. It's always the same cycle that continues to exist. But yes, it's an important element, and I tell you why. Not just because as an organization, the IRGC is certainly a negative structure that benefits the regime, but is a tool of repression at home and expanding violence abroad. It's also important because part of our strategy of change is to be able to have a formula beyond this regime. I believe many elements that are part of the military and paramilitary forces. I'm not talking about the very top that has financial interest to stay with the regime, but I'm talking about the bulk that can certainly be separated from the top, that don't have their hands soiled with the blood of the people. They should be able to see a future for themselves in the sense that they are not condemned to go down with a sinking ship. Bringing pressure now encourages more defection. As much as we need people to revolt against this regime, we have to encourage maximum defections, whether it's the civilian sector or the paramilitary sector, only to limit the amount of resistance at the very end that the regime could pose, but have them on our side of the equation as opposed to the regime side of the equation.
As you're talking about pressure, what if the Islamic regime feels a lot of pressure if their downfall gets closer? Do you see the risk that it could take nuclear weapons?
Look, they're using human bodies they weaponize hostages in order to try to find the leverage. Do you think they will hesitate during the nuclear weapon for leverage? Why would they enrich uranium to the extent, if the argument is that it's for peaceful use? Why would they have all these, missile programs and ballistic programs? That's not to bring electricity to villages. Certainly, the arrow dictates that they want to make sure that they will ultimately have a means of deterrence. And if you're asking me, are they crazy enough to actually use it? Yeah. Well, this regime has proven time again that it will not hesitate to act violently against its own citizenry. But that's the entire argument. When people say, why does Israel do what it needs to do in order to protect itself? Because it's a legitimate existential threat to them. But it's not just about the Israelis or the Iranian people. The rest of the world should be concerned. There's no reason for this regime to still be there. And the best solution is to put an end to it rather than to worry, well, what if they got the nuclear weapon? Or what if they had this? The whole problem is the nature of the system that creates all of these problems. The only solution is for this regime to completely disappear so we don't have to worry about all these things anymore.
But how to do it, in a nutshell?
Well, how to do it, as I said, continue the policy of maximum pressure on the regime, but now it's time to invest on the alternative, the Iranian people. Therefore, you need to have a policy of maximum support to the nation. Help them technologically so communication with the outside world is not disrupted, because the regime is trying to asphyxiate all the time. As a person in the media, you would most likely appreciate censorship and barring communication. It's a vital tool for awareness and also organizing ourselves. That's one thing that is critical. As I said, repurpose frozen assets to help the Iranian financially to have the means to cope even better and structure themselves. These are the components that are built in, and we have propositions about that, multiple ways that you can actually help in the framework of maximum support. That will lead, therefore, to a faster crescendo of the regime becoming weaker and weaker and weaker and ultimately collapse. It could happen in a matter of months, provided that you decide to do it now, while this window of opportunity now exists in front of us. And I think we can get there fairly soon, provided that massive reset in foreign policy begins to take place. And again, I hope that European governments will really realize that you have tried it for 46 years. It doesn't work. It's time that you reset your foreign policy, this time with the objective of putting an end to this regime, not because you say so, but because Iranians want so. So help them.
The Women, Life, Freedom uprising is considered to be the first feminist revolution in history. Where does the incredible courage and modernity of Iranian women come from?
You know, we had throughout history women that were symbolically representing Iran's might and force as warriors, as fighters. In modern days, we had women at many levels of governance in different capacities, in the military, in the judiciary. And, you know, that shows that, you know, Iranians who were, and the women who were emancipated, you know, I'm going to Geneva for the Human Rights Conference. You know, I have to remind our Swiss friends that Iranian women had the right to vote 4 years before the Swiss women in Switzerland did. We were on par and on course to be a modern country, and women played a crucial role. And Iranians today see themselves, whether they're female or male, as co-partners in bringing a country forward. And what the massive revolution triggered was not so much in the Iranian mindset of the role of women. It triggered something in the Western mindset that always thought that in the Middle East is backward, women have not much of a role. And the Iran that we had already provided all those liberties. And imagine if we go in the full direction of complete liberalization, how important their roles would be. For us, it's a given. The West is to say, this is not a miracle. This is not like, oh my God, it's the first time. You just use the word, the first feminist revolution. It may be true from a point of view of comparing to the rest of the world, but it's not the first time the Iranian women had an impact on our society. In fact, they had a crucial impact on our society, which is why today, when the Women, Life, Freedom in Iran started to be chanted, the women in Iran chanted also men, and prosperity, to say, look, we're not trying to make this a feminine issue or a masculine issue. Hand in hand, men and women are moving forward. That's the beauty of it. So absolutely, I think this is something that will prove that Iran is ahead of the curve with respect to our immediate neighbors in terms of to what degree of advancement we had received, and only to lose it to a regime that immediately rendered our women as second-class citizens. So the motivation is there. The proof is already established. The potential that Iran represents on many aspects, we already have that. The world needs to believe in us more than they believe that this regime is their answer. If we do that, we will all win.
That sounds convincing. Your Highness, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay.